And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. The year 2020 has seen several notable 50th anniversaries. The anniversary of things that happened back in 1970, including the first Earth Day, the breakup of the Beatles. 1970 was the year that Paul McCartney officially told the other three he wasn't working with them anymore. It took a few more years for it to wind through the courts to get everything figured out, but for all intents and purposes, the Beatles did break up 50 years ago. And of course, of even more immediate interest from our perspective is we had two 50th wedding anniversaries this summer here in the church, Marvin and Donna Kuhn and Fred and Lynn Coors. There was also a 50th anniversary of a movie that some of you with good memories may remember. It was called Love Story, and it was one of the sappiest romance movies and also one of the most popular ever made. It was the story of two young lovers played by Ali MacGraw and Ryan O'Neal, who were doomed because of her terminal cancer. A real tearjerker, a three-hanky affair, as they say. One of the most enduring things to come out of that movie was a line that was repeated a couple of times, which said, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." Love means never having to say you're sorry. And for some reason, that line and that idea really took hold in the American consciousness. It was emblazoned on shirts and in comics. A top 40 song was made about it. Psychologists discussed and debated its merits. And that one single line, "Love is never having to say you're sorry," was ranked by the American Film Institute as the 13th greatest line in all of movie history. And that's a lot of fuss and a lot of attention for essentially an idea that on its face is really, really dumb. Love is never having to say you're sorry. Has anyone here who has been in a long-term relationship, whether a marriage or any other kind of relationship, does anybody think that's a good idea? Has anybody gone through the course of your relationship never having to say you're sorry, even after you've screwed up monumentally? It's just a bad idea, but it shows you how corrupted our notions of love and loving one another have become in our modern culture. We see this expression of love in books and movies and magazines and the Hallmark Channel, and all of it is a romanticized, incorrect view of what love really should be and how to love one another. That's what we're talking about, loving one another. That's right what it says there in our New Testament reading from Romans 13:8. We are told to love one another, and that's certainly not the only place you see that in the Bible. Jesus talked about that constantly and told his disciples quite plainly as he was returning to heaven, "I give you a new commandment now, love one another as I have loved you." That is all over the New Testament. It's all over the Bible. Love one another. But if we've gotten it wrong, if we're not understanding it right, then what does it mean to love one another? How do we do that? And what does that look like? Well, one thing we can say with certainty is what it's not. And that is, loving one another is not conditional love. It is not the idea that I will love you as long as you're doing for me what I want you to do, as long as you're pleasing me or living up to the expectations I have for you. I think everybody can agree that's a totally corrupt notion of the idea of how to love someone else, that we would only love them as long as we can get something back from them. But you know what? I think that corruption is so ingrained in our popular culture today that that's the reason we see so many failed marriages and so many failed relationships, because people go into them with the expectation that I'm going to get something out of the other person, and as long as that other person is giving me that and I'm getting what I want, I will love them. But when I stop getting that, it's over. When I stop getting that, whether it's sexual pleasure or a good time or enjoying someone's company, whatever, as long as I'm getting that, I will love you. But as soon as I stop getting that, the relationship ends. And I think we can all agree and understand how dangerous that is, how wrong that is, but at the same time, how ingrained that has become in our culture. There is another corrupt idea about how to love one another that really sounds good on its face. It sounds good in theory. And that is, we should love others unconditionally. We should love others unconditionally. I'm sure you've heard this, you've probably said it, and you may even think that you're loving others unconditionally in your relationship. In other words, to love someone unconditionally means, and it's the idea that says, well, God made you the way you are. And who am I to try to change that or to say that what you're doing is wrong or unacceptable? So to love someone unconditionally has come to mean I'm going to accept whatever you do. Whatever you are and whatever you do, I'm going to accept that, and that's become the definition of unconditional love. And that's totally wrong. Think of it this way. Say an adult child or a young teenager or what have you who comes to you and says, you know what? I've been thinking about my career plans and I've decided to become a porn star. They make a lot of money, and yes, quite frankly, they do. They make a lot of money. You get to do something you like to do, set your own hours, maybe even get a little famous, get in the movies. That seems like the career choice for me. Are you going to tell your own child or someone that you love, you know what? That's fine. I accept you for who you are, and because I love you unconditionally, I'm going to let you do that. No. That is utterly and totally ridiculous. And yet, by the way, because our notion of love in our culture has become so corrupted, that's exactly what we saw back in the spring when it was announced that Steven Spielberg's adopted daughter decided to become a porn star. That she announced that was going to be her career choice. And guess what? Mom and Dad said, great, that's what you want to do. We love you unconditionally. Someone, somewhere, has to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. Don't do that. I love you enough to tell you no. So don't fall into the trap that says love is unconditional. And there's another corruption of how to love someone else too. And it's based on another popular idea that also sounds good in theory. The idea of freedom. And this is another popular saying that's been around for a while. If you love something, you've got to give it its freedom. You've got to let it go. In other words, to love someone else is to give him or her the freedom, again, to do whatever he or she wants. That's loving someone. I love you enough to let you do whatever you want. I want you to imagine yourself as a young mother cooking in the kitchen all day to feed a family of young children. You cook up a delicious meal of meatloaf and potatoes and broccoli. And you serve this meal. And one of your young children says, I don't want that. I want cookies and ice cream for dinner instead. Well, if we love someone and want to give them freedom, that child, should he or she not have the freedom to get what he wants? Should they not be able to get the cookies and ice cream? Should they not be allowed to express themselves in that way? And sadly, this kind of permissiveness is exactly what we're seeing in our school systems today. It is a permissiveness, it is a quote-unquote freedom that says little Johnny can do whatever he or she wants as a means of growing and learning and expressing himself. And we don't have the right to tell him no. And all that's doing, besides frustrating teachers, is growing a generation of lazy, selfish, entitled children. Love does not mean, in all cases, giving others freedom. All right, so we know what love is not. It's not conditional, it's not unconditional, and it's not necessarily based on freedom. So what is it? And how do we love others? Well, we've talked a little bit in the past about this idea of agape love that the Bible speaks of, the self-sacrificial love, the giving love, the love that Jesus modeled, the giving up of himself on the cross, and the giving of his own life for us. And we are called to give our lives in service to others. And that's certainly part of that. But I think there's another part of it too. And that's what we see in our Old Testament reading from Ezekiel, and especially in verse 8. As we think about that verse, it seems that one way we can truly love others is to model the love of Jesus, show the love of Jesus to others, tell them about the love of Jesus, and walk with them in that love. Model, show, tell, and walk the love of Jesus. In other words, the best way you can love someone else is to bring to them the love of Christ and have them become a follower of Jesus and live the life that God created them for in Jesus. And this is not just a good idea. This is not just a suggestion. This is something God has commanded us to do, and that brings us back to that verse in Ezekiel. Ezekiel 33:8, which basically says, go tell people about God. And if you tell someone about God and show them God and model God and walk with God, and then they turn away and want nothing to do with Him, then the problem is theirs. They are the ones who are lost. But if you don't tell, if you don't show, if you don't walk, if you don't model, then not only are they lost, but their blood is on your hands. That sounds pretty serious. Pretty serious how important it is to reach out to others with the love of Christ. We have the very curious notion in our modern world that loving people is basically leaving them alone, letting them do whatever they want, make their own choices, go their own way, ignore them, and don't worry about them because we're all big boys and girls and we can all make our own decisions. God is reminding us that that's not loving someone. That's watching them head to their own damnation. I've used this metaphor many, many times. If you saw someone driving 100 miles an hour down the wrong way of a one-way street and there was going to be an impending head-on collision, would you not, if you could, call them on their cell phone and tell them, turn around before it's too late? You're going the wrong way. You are going to die. Is it not the same in our faith lives? Why is it we feel so comfortable watching people head 100 miles an hour down the wrong way of life, headed for certain death and destruction, and we sit there on our hands and we say, they have the freedom to make their own choice. I love them unconditionally, so I'm going to let them do whatever they want. God is calling us to something more than that. If we truly, truly care and love for others, as God has called us to do, we care what happens to them in the next life, even more than what happens to them in this life. I'm not much of a poetry person. It never has appealed to me. Some people really like it. One of the more famous poets of all time was the English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who lived in the 1800s. And one of her more famous poems includes a line just as famous and more so than the one in Love Story. It was Elizabeth Barrett Browning who wrote, "How do I love thee? How do I love thee?" And then she goes on to talk about the depth and height and width of our powerful love for other people. How do I love thee? That's perhaps even a line you may have said to someone at some point in your life. But if we truly, truly love others as God has commanded us to love them, we cannot sit idly by. We cannot sit on our hands. We cannot say, it's your choice. You have the freedom to do whatever you want. Godspeed, go live a happy, healthy life. I wish you well. If we truly love others, we must tell them about Jesus and his love. Model that love for them. Show it to them. And then walk with them together in that love. That's the way we truly can love one another as we are called to do, because it is the only kind of love that lasts. The love we have for other people is wonderful. It's powerful. It's essential to our lives. But the love of God is eternal. It is the only love that lasts forever. And it is the only love that will bring them to Jesus. Amen.